If you had to pack your entire life into a single suitcase, what would you keep? More importantly, what would you let go? Thomas stood in the middle of his cluttered living room, surrounded by boxes filled with old memories, faded photographs, business awards, books he never got around to reading, and clothes he hadn't worn in years. At 72, he had accumulated a lifetime's worth of things, yet for some reason he felt heavier than ever. He always imagined that retirement would bring peace. After decades of working tirelessly, he thought he would finally feel free. But instead, he felt restless, weighed down not just by the things in his home, but by something far less tangible: regret, expectations, old habits, and a nagging feeling that he wasn't truly living. One day, as he was sorting through an old chest in the attic, he stumbled upon a letter from his late wife, Margaret. The paper was yellowed with age, her handwriting slightly faded but still elegant. It was a letter she had written to herself when she turned 60, a reflection on the life she wanted to live in her later years. "I don't want to spend my remaining days worrying about things I cannot change, chasing achievements that no longer matter, or holding on to people who do not bring me joy. I want to spend my time laughing, walking barefoot on the grass, feeling the sun on my face and cherishing every moment I have left." Thomas sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. Margaret had understood something he had not, that life is not about adding more, but about learning to let go. At that moment, he made a decision. He would stop carrying the unnecessary weight that had been holding him back. He would let go of the need to be constantly busy, the habit of mindless spending, the anxiety over small, insignificant things. He would learn to say no without guilt, to walk away from toxic relationships, and to embrace change instead of fearing it. Most importantly, he would stop waiting to live. But change wasn't easy. Every time he tried to let go, an inner voice whispered, "What if you need this later? What if you regret it?" Letting go felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, uncertain of what lay ahead. And maybe you felt that way too. Maybe you're in your 70s or approaching them, feeling the weight of a lifetime pressing on your shoulders. Maybe you've spent years doing what was expected of you, only to wonder now, is this all there is? If you've ever felt that heaviness, this story is for you. This is not a story about loss, but about freedom. It's about the profound transformation that comes when we finally release what no longer serves us and make room for what truly matters. Over the next few minutes, I want to take you on a journey through Thomas's experience, through the lessons he learned and the burdens he chose to set down. And as you listen, I invite you to reflect on your own life. What are you still holding on to? What fears, habits, or relationships have you been carrying, even though they no longer bring you joy? And most importantly, what would happen if you let them go? If this message resonates with you, I encourage you to stay with me until the end. And if you find even one small piece of wisdom here, consider sharing it with someone you love. Let's start a conversation about living intentionally, about stepping into this new chapter of life with clarity and joy. And if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Together, we'll continue exploring the wisdom that comes with age, the beauty of simplicity, and the power of choosing a life that truly reflects who we are. Now, let's begin. Letting go of the need to stay busy, only doing what truly matters. 500 words. Thomas had spent his entire life in motion. As a young man, he built his career with relentless ambition, climbing the corporate ladder, working late nights, and measuring his worth by how much he accomplished. Even after retiring at 68, he couldn't sit still. He took on consulting work, volunteered for multiple organizations, and filled his calendar with obligations, anything to avoid the terrifying thought of being idle. But at 72, something shifted. One evening, he found himself sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a planner filled with meetings, calls, and commitments. Yet, despite the packed schedule, he felt empty. Why do I still feel unfulfilled? He wondered. The realization hit him like a wave. He wasn't busy because he wanted to be. He was busy because he was afraid of what would happen if he stopped. For years, he had equated productivity with purpose, movement with meaning. But what if that wasn't true? That week, something happened that changed his perspective. He had promised to help an old colleague with a project, something he didn't truly care about, but agreed to out of habit. On the morning of the meeting, he passed by the park near his home and saw an elderly man sitting under a large oak tree, feeding the birds. The man looked peaceful, as if time itself had slowed down for him. Thomas hesitated. He had a choice: continue rushing to his next commitment, or pause just for a moment. For the first time in years, he chose to sit down. At first, it felt unnatural. He kept glancing at his watch, feeling the itch to do something. But as he listened to the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, the laughter of children playing nearby, and the quiet rustle of the birds pecking at the ground, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. He sat there for nearly an hour. No meetings, no deadlines, just being. That day, he made a decision. He would stop saying yes to things that didn't align with what truly mattered. He would no longer work just to stay busy. Instead, he would ask himself a simple question before taking on any commitment. Does this bring me joy, meaning, or connection? If the answer was no, he would let it go. Over the next few months, his life began to change. He quit the projects he didn't care about. He stopped accepting every invitation out of obligation, and instead of filling his time with work, he spent it on things that made his heart full: long walks, reading books he had neglected for years, reconnecting with old friends, and simply sitting in his backyard, watching the world move without rushing to keep up with it. For the first time in his life, he understood being busy is not the same as being fulfilled. And maybe that's something we all need to remember: stopping mindless spending, choosing value. Over possessions, 500 words. Thomas used to believe that happiness could be bought. A new car, a designer watch, a bigger television. Each purchase gave him a brief rush of excitement, a fleeting sense of accomplishment, but it never lasted. Soon, he would find himself craving something else, something newer, something better. For decades, this cycle repeated itself. His home became filled with things he rarely used, suits he no longer wore, kitchen gadgets that collected dust, and books he bought with good intentions but never read. He told himself that these things mattered, that they were proof of his success, but deep down, he felt no closer to happiness than before. One evening, while sorting through his closet, Thomas stumbled upon a silk tie still in its packaging. It had been an impulse buy from years ago, one of many. He held it in his hands and tried to remember why he had bought it in the first place. Was it because he actually needed it? Or because in that moment he had believed it would somehow make his life better? He sighed and looked around the room. Shelves overflowing with objects, drawers packed with forgotten belongings. And yet, despite all of it, there were days when he still felt empty. The realization hit him hard. He had spent so much time accumulating things, but so little time appreciating what he already had. That night, he made a decision. Instead of chasing the next purchase, he would focus on experiences over possessions, meaning over materialism. The next morning, he started small. He picked up a book he had been meaning to read instead of browsing online for new ones. He spent an afternoon at the park instead of at the mall, and when he passed by a store window showcasing the latest watch collection, he asked himself, do I really need this? Or am I just trying to fill a space that things will never truly fill? Over time, his spending habits changed. Instead of buying things he would forget about in a week, he invested in moments: a train ticket to visit his daughter, an afternoon at a local cafe reconnecting with an old friend, a simple home-cooked meal shared with neighbors. And with each choice, something remarkable happened. He felt lighter, happier, His home became less cluttered, but more importantly, so did his mind. He no longer sought happiness in shopping bags or brand names, but in laughter, in quiet mornings, in the simple pleasure of being present. One day, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, watching the sunrise, he realized something profound. The richest moments in life cost nothing at all, and maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of wealth worth chasing. Letting go of small worries. Learning to let go. 500 words. Thomas used to let the smallest things ruin his day. A slow driver in front of him, a misplaced set of keys, a forgotten appointment. Each inconvenience would spark irritation, setting off a chain reaction of frustration that lingered for hours. He would replay conversations in his mind, dwell on mistakes, and let minor annoyances steal his peace. But one day, something changed. It happened on an ordinary afternoon at the grocery store. Thomas stood in line, tapping his fingers impatiently against his cart. The elderly woman in front of him was moving slowly, counting out coins one by one, her hands trembling slightly. Thomas could feel the irritation rising. He had places to be, things to do. But then, he noticed something. The woman wasn't just paying for groceries. She was chatting with the cashier, sharing a small moment of warmth, of connection. And suddenly, he saw things differently. What if, instead of letting this delay frustrate him, he chose to embrace the pause? What if he simply breathed and let go? For the first time in a long time, he stopped watching the clock. He smiled at the woman as she gathered her bags. When she turned and met his gaze, she returned the smile, a small, quiet moment of human connection that he would have missed if he had stayed wrapped up in his own impatience. That night, Thomas reflected on all the times he had let small worries steal his joy. The spilled coffee, the bad weather, the unreturned phone calls. None of it had truly mattered. None of it had changed the course of his life. But his reactions to them, those had shaped his days. So he made a conscious decision. Whenever something frustrated him, he would ask himself one simple question: will this matter a year from now? If the answer was no, he would let it go. At first, it wasn't easy. Years of habit had trained his mind to react, but little by little, he changed. The next time he got stuck in traffic, instead of gripping the wheel in frustration, he rolled down the window and listened to the birds outside. When he misplaced his glasses, he chuckled instead of cursing under his breath. And when it rained on the day of his long-awaited picnic, he simply took his coffee to the porch and watched the drops dance on the pavement. And a strange thing happened. His days felt lighter. The world hadn't changed. The delays, the mishaps, the imperfections. They were still there. But he had changed. He had learned that peace wasn't about controlling life's circumstances. It was about choosing how to respond to them. One evening, as he sat on a park bench watching the sunset, he smiled to himself. All those years, he thought, I was waiting for life to be perfect. But maybe, life was already perfect. I just needed to stop fighting it. Learning to say no. Keeping time for yourself. 500 words. For most of his life, Thomas had been a yes man. Yes to extra projects at work. Yes to social events he didn't enjoy. Yes to helping neighbors, relatives, and even distant acquaintances, often at the expense of his own time and energy. He had always believed that saying yes made him a good person, a dependable friend, a responsible father, a helpful colleague. But by the time he reached his 70s, he was exhausted. It wasn't just physical tiredness. It was the kind of deep, soul-worn exhaustion that comes from giving too much and receiving too little in return. Then one evening, while having dinner with an old friend, he heard a simple phrase that changed his perspective. Every time you say yes to something you don't want to do, you're saying no to yourself. The words struck him like a bolt of lightning. He thought about all the times he had agreed to things out of obligation, helping organize events he had no interest in, attending gatherings that drained him, taking on responsibilities that weren't his to carry. And in doing so, he had denied himself time for what truly mattered. his own peace, his own joy, his own life. So Thomas decided to try something different. The next time someone asked him for a favor that he didn't want to do, he hesitated. His old instincts screamed at him to say yes, to keep the peace, to avoid disappointing anyone. But instead, he took a deep breath and said, "I can't commit to that right now." And to his surprise, the world didn't end. No one was angry. No one disowned him. The only thing that changed was that, for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his own life. From then on, he became more mindful about where he spent his time. He stopped filling his schedule with obligations that drained him. Instead, he protected his time like a valuable treasure, saying yes only to the things that aligned with his values and brought him joy. He still helped others, but now he did it out of genuine willingness, not guilt. He still spent time with people, but only those who uplifted him. He no longer felt the need to explain himself, to justify his choices, because he had finally learned the most important lesson of all. Saying no to others is sometimes the greatest act of saying yes to yourself. One morning, as he sat on his porch, with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise without a single unwanted obligation hanging over his head, he smiled. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just making time for himself, he was honoring it, embracing change. Instead of fearing it, seeing change as a new beginning. 500 words. For most of his life, Thomas had feared change. He found comfort in routines, in familiar places, in the predictable rhythm of everyday life. Change to him had always felt like loss, leaving behind what was known, stepping into something uncertain. And so, whenever life shifted, he resisted. But life, as it always does, kept moving forward. The most painful change came when his wife, Margaret, passed away. They had spent nearly 50 years together, building a life filled with love and shared moments. When she was gone, everything around him felt empty, the house too quiet, the bed too big, the mornings too long. At first, he clung to the past. He refused to change a single thing in their home. Margaret's favourite chair remained untouched. Her books sat neatly on the bedside table. He even kept setting the table for two at dinner, as if somehow doing so would keep her presence alive. But deep down, he knew. He wasn't really holding on to her. He was holding on to the way things used to be. One evening, while walking through the park, he saw a group of children playing near a small pond. He watched as one of them, a little girl, picked up a bright red leaf that had just fallen from a tree. She held it up to her mother and said, "Look, it changed colour. It's so beautiful." Thomas stood there for a long time, staring at the trees around him. The leaves were changing. And they weren't resisting it. They weren't afraid. They were simply letting go, embracing the new season ahead. That night, he walked into Margaret's study and picked up one of her books. It was one she had always wanted to read, but never got around to finishing. He sat down, opened it to the first page, and started reading. It was a small step, but it was the first sign that he was ready to move forward. In the weeks that followed, Thomas began making small changes. He rearranged the furniture. He finally took that trip to the mountains that Margaret had always dreamed of. He joined a local book club, met new people, and even tried painting for the first time. And the more he embraced change, the more he realized it wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about making room for the future. Change wasn't something to be feared. It was a doorway to new experiences, new friendships, new versions of himself he had yet to meet. One morning, as he sat outside sipping his coffee, watching the golden leaves fall gently to the ground, he smiled. Maybe, he thought, life isn't about holding on. Maybe it's about learning to let go so we can make space for what's to come. Thomas stood in the middle of his bedroom, staring at the old suitcase resting on his bed. For years, it had sat untouched in the corner of his closet, collecting dust. It was filled with remnants of a life he had once lived. Old letters, keepsakes, souvenirs from past travels, and forgotten trinkets that had once held meaning. But today was different. Today, he was ready to open it. He unzipped the suitcase and lifted the lid, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and hesitation. He carefully sifted through the contents, running his fingers over faded photographs and time-worn pages. Some things brought a smile to his face, others a twinge of sadness. Each item told a story, carried a memory. But as he held them, he asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. Does this still serve me? Does this still bring me joy? One by one, he made his choices. The guilt of saying no when he wanted to say yes. Gone. The pressure to always be busy, to prove his worth through productivity. Gone. The tendency to stress over small inconveniences, to let moments of frustration steal his peace. Gone. The need to hold on to relationships that no longer uplifted him. Gone. The fear of change, the hesitation to step into the unknown. Gone. With each unnecessary burden he placed aside, something remarkable happened. His suitcase became lighter, and so did he. For the first time in decades, Thomas felt free. He realized then that life isn't about how much we can carry. It's about what we choose to carry. We spend so much time accumulating possessions, responsibilities, expectations. We hold on to regrets, to past versions of ourselves, to fears that no longer serve us. But what if we stopped? What if, instead of clinging to everything, we only kept what truly mattered? For Thomas, it wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making space for the present. The peace of an unhurried morning, the joy of a conversation that feels effortless, the beauty of a life no longer dictated by unnecessary burdens. He had spent years chasing success, collecting things, and filling his time with obligations that felt important at the time. But now, as he sat in his quiet home, surrounded only by what truly mattered, he understood something he never had before. Letting go wasn't about losing. It was about gaining something far more valuable: clarity, peace, and the ability to truly live. So now, I ask you, what's in your suitcase? Are you carrying expectations that no longer fit? Are you holding on to stress, obligations, or relationships that weigh you down? And more importantly, what would happen if you let them go? Imagine a life where your mind isn't cluttered with worries, where your time isn't consumed by obligations you no longer care about. Imagine waking up each day with a lighter heart, knowing that you've kept only the things that truly bring you peace and joy. Doesn't that sound like freedom? If you've been feeling like your suitcase is too heavy, maybe it's time to set it down. Maybe it's time to let go of the need to be constantly busy, to stop chasing things that don't bring real happiness, to release the small worries that steal your peace, to say no when something doesn't align with your values, to embrace change instead of fearing it, because life isn't about holding on to everything. It's about choosing what's worth holding on to. If Thomas's story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. What is one thing you can let go of today? A habit, a worry, a commitment that no longer serves you, a relationship that drains your energy, a belief that has kept you from living freely. And if this message touched you, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Let's start a conversation, not about what we can gain, but about what we can release. And if you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we explore not just how to age, but how to live fully, at any age. Because the best chapters of our lives aren't behind us. They're the ones we have yet to write.